This is Better Than News, and I'm Joe Darginio with your weekly White House report for February 11th through the 17th. During that time, President Biden renewed sanctions against Libya, renewed restrictions for American ships in waters near Cuba, and dumped the most convoluted executive order the world may ever see. Take a look. Here on February 16th of 2023, President Biden issues this on the whitehouse.gov presidential actions page, an executive order on further advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. Oddly enough, through the entirety of this executive order as it's posted, this particular executive order is not identified by a number. It does, however, address, amend, or even revoke 18 other executive orders. So this is going to be a very lengthy process to break this down and see exactly what changes are being made. But you can see in this statement the words executive order appear 31 times. Just as an example, Executive Order 14035. Next one, the one they first talked about, 13985. Here's Executive Order 13989, Executive Order 14008, Executive Order 14020, and on and on and on and on. And there are some spots where it amends others that are not featured on this page, and we go to look at those, and those amend yet others. So this is going to be kind of a convoluted web to pick apart. I'm going to do a special report on that. It's going to be long. There's a lot of information. I'm going to hopefully identify areas that we as citizens need to be concerned about more than others, because obviously the news, whoever you get your news from on a daily basis, the pundits or the other media outlets, they're not going to go as in-depth on this as I'm about to. I've actually already begun the process. I just haven't been able to complete it in a timely fashion, so it is going to be secondary to a less thorough summary here on the weekly White House report. Now this is a page that they have provided here in the statements and releases, a fact sheet on this executive order. Now again, they talk about on his first day in office he signed Executive Order 13985, but here it doesn't say what this executive order number is that we're looking at here, which apparently is a new executive order. But they talk about advancing gender equity and equality at home and abroad, because clearly that's our concern. Advancing environmental justice, which I'll definitely be taking a close look at. Now, many of the items that are in here certainly on the surface seem like very noble, worthwhile ideas and projects. I'm going to be surprised if I don't find something questionable in here. Let's see. Department of Agriculture is administering $3 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act, which we know is his big recent legislation, and $2.2 billion in assistance to farmers who have experienced discrimination in USDA's farm lending programs. That's going to contrast very well with some of the other things going on in that category. And Department of Treasury, Department of Transportation, Department of Housing and Urban Development, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, is in this Department of State, U.S. Agency for International Development, Department of Veterans Affairs. Well, you made them go to war for you and you did horrible things to them. You owe them something. Department of Defense, Department of the Interior, Council on Environmental Quality, and the Office of Management and Budget, White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And so, as soon as possible, I will be making a summary of that executive order, which at this point has yet to be identified by number. We're talking about the one that was put out on February 16th. So we go on. On February 17th, 2023, President Biden issued this notice on the continuation of the national emergency with respect to Libya. And so we're going to take a look at that. That is referring to Executive Order 13566 from February 25th, 2011. And that was declared under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to deal with the unusual and extraordinary threat to national security and foreign policy of the United States constituted by the actions of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, who was alive at that time. His government and close associates, which took extreme measures against the people of Libya, including by using weapons of war, mercenaries, and wanton violence against unarmed civilians. In addition, there was a risk that Libyan state assets, and you notice they make sure to refer to those types of things, would be misappropriated by Gaddafi, members of his government, his family, close associates, if those assets were not protected. Well, of course, who do they want to protect it? We'll get into that. So this initial executive order, 13566, authority vested in me as president by the Constitution, including the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And of course, we're going to look at that, the National Emergencies Act, and Section 301 of Title III United States Code. So they're talking about serious risk that Libyan state assets will be misappropriated. So he hereby orders and this, of course, is left in the hands of the Secretary of Treasury in consultation with the Secretary of State. We're going to look at that also. And they identify government of Libya, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, or his children, specifically mentioned there. So after identifying the targets, all property and interests in property that are in the United States, that hereafter come within the United States, yada yada yada, possession or control of any overseas branch of the government of Libya, its agencies and controlled entities, and the Central Bank of Libya are blocked and may not be transferred, paid, exported, withdrawn, or otherwise dealt in. And there need be no prior notice of a listing or determination made pursuant to Section 1 of this order. Blocked from making donations, making of any contribution or provisions of funds, goods, or services, any transaction that evades or avoids, any conspiracy formed to violate any of the prohibitions set forth. And here we are in the definitions, and here we go. The Secretary of Treasury, in consultation with the Secretary of State, is hereby authorized to take such actions, including the promulgation of the rules and regulations, and to employ all powers granted to the President for purposes of this order. Secretary of Treasury may redelegate any of these functions and all agencies of the United States government are hereby directed to take all appropriate measures within their authority to carry out the provisions of this order. Here we are again mentioning the Secretary of Treasury in consultation with the Secretary of State, and again, so they get to make a lot of the determinations in regards to this action. The recent action makes another reference to Executive Order 13726, so of course we take a look at that. And we have to dig into the archives for that. So once again, this is a lot of blocking state financial institutions, the Libyan National Oil Company, and prohibitions in section include but not limited to contribution or provision of funds, goods, or services, receipt of any funds, goods, or services, and they make reference to the Government of National Accord, formed pursuant to the terms of the Libyan Political Agreement, signed in Morocco in 2015. And I'm actually going to skip taking a look at that, sorry. But you have it there, Libyan Political Agreement, signed in Skirat, Morocco on December 17th, 2015. That may have a bearing on what we're interpreting here. And again, giving power to make determinations to the Secretary of Treasury, and again, Secretary of Treasury in consultation with the Secretary of State. Employ all powers granted to the President by the IEEPA or the UNPA. Now, it also makes reference to a United Nations Security Council Resolution 1970 from 2011. So we look at United Nations Digital Library Resolution 1970 from 2011, adopted on February 26th. And it says, expressing grave concern at the situation in Libya, deploring the gross systematic violation of human rights, welcoming the condemnation by Arab League, the African Union, and the Secretary General of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, of the serious human violation rights, stressing, recalling, expressing, reaffirming, mindful, and acting, taking measures under Article 41, under Chapter 7 of the Charter of the United Nations, urges Libyan authorities, demands an immediate end to violence, and calls for steps to fulfill the legitimate demands of the population, urges the Libyan authorities to act with the utmost restraint, respect human rights and international humanitarian law, allow immediate access for international human rights monitors, ensure the safety of all foreign nationals and their assets, and facilitate the departure of those wishing to leave the country, ensure the safe passage of humanitarian and medical supplies, immediately lift restrictions on all forms of media, request all member states, to the extent possible, cooperate in the evacuation of those foreign nationals wishing to leave the country. And of course, in here is an arms embargo. It does allow for some things, protective clothing, non-lethal military equipment, solely for humanitarian or protective use. And I find it interesting that they can have military-grade protective elements that are banned here in the United States, oddly enough. Body armor in particular. And it's demanding that Libya cease export of all arms and related material, and that all member states prohibit the procurement of such items, call upon states neighboring the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya to inspect in accordance with their national authorities and legislation, international law, law of the sea, relevant international aviation agreements, all cargo to and from the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya in their territory, including seaports and airports, discouraging travel to Libya. All member states shall freeze without delay all funds, other financial assets, and economic resources which are in their territories, which are owned and controlled directly or indirectly by individuals or entities listed in Annex 2 of this resolution, which of course is Libya and representatives thereof, and associates of Gaddafi. And it's obviously sanctions and economic blockages. So at least they go a little more in depth. Oh, and here's a list of people who are banned from traveling. Oh, and assets freeze from Muammar Gaddafi, of several different Muammar Gaddafis, probably all members of his family, presumably. So it's obvious the United States is marching in step with the United Nations on this. So this executive order goes on to say that the national emergency declared on February 25th, 2011 must continue in effect. We're continuing for 1 year the national emergency declared in Executive Order 13566. So, Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of State are largely responsible for determinations and actions based on the sanctions against Libya. These people who were delegated a presidential level of authority in matters of trade and transport with Libya, and you'll find in many other cases that at the time of Obama was Timothy Geithner. And Timothy Geithner was the Secretary of Treasury under Obama. He, prior to that, was Federal Reserve Bank of New York president, and went on after the Obama administration to join the Council on Foreign Relations, which is something that we're going to talk a lot about as I can. That's a really big subject, but it is a think tank. When you hear Council on Foreign Relations, you kind of almost think that may be a federal office, but no, it is an independent and supposedly nonpartisan nonprofit organization. It's based in New York City with additional offices. Its membership has included senior politicians, numerous secretaries of state, CIA directors, and of course we're going to get into the CIA quite a bit, bankers, lawyers, professors, corporate directors, and CEOs, and senior media figures. So that is definitely an organization that we're going to look into a fair bit as soon as possible. There are probably going to be some special reports on that. And the Secretary of State under Obama was, of course, none other than Hillary Clinton. And despite controversy over still here in 2023 not having any answers to the emails surrounding the Benghazi attack, which I believe there's a lot more than the modern media wants to let us in on in regards to that. Now, how much they actually know is unclear, but they certainly didn't present a solid story about what happened there. Now, under Biden currently, we have Janet Yellen, who is the Secretary of Treasury now. She also served as Federal Reserve Chair and Council of Economic Advisors. Let's take a quick look at that. is an agency within the executive office. So she essentially was in his cabinet, and then went back to the Federal Reserve, and now has come back to today's cabinet to serve as the Secretary of Treasury. And of course, the modern Secretary of State we've talked about, that is, of course, Anthony Blinken. We'll recall from our previous video that he has come from an advisory firm, West Tech Advisors, and one of the notes from that story includes that he helped a military contractor get a $7 million contract with our Air Force, and then went on to serve as Secretary of State. He clearly has a link to the military industrial complex. There is a lot of information about Colonel Muammar Gaddafi and the gold standard. If you search for those terms, you will find a variety of information that indicates that Muammar Gaddafi was prosecuted for trying essentially to establish a gold standard for his nation's currency. And there is a lot of incentive to try to manipulate a large amount of gold that is under control of Libya's government, particularly that of Gaddafi, who was killed. Also, here on February 17th, the President issued a notice of the continuation of the national emergency with respect to Cuba and the emergency authority relating to the regulation of the anchorage and movement of vessels. And basically what that talks about is mandating that American vessels stay out of Cuban waters. And clearly we've had strained relations with Cuba for decades. But I find it very interesting that part of this declaration says that entry of a United States registered vessel into Cuban territorial waters continues to be detrimental to the foreign policy of the United States because such entry could facilitate a mass migration from Cuba. Well, that struck me as funny considering some of the issues surrounding migration. And so I took a look, and I had to find out that, at least according to whatever source this was, the population of Cuba is somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 million. And we're worried about some or all of 11 million coming to America with this executive order. And I'm wondering how that contrasts to other elements of our current immigration system. So keep your boat out of Cuban waters for now, and hopefully we'll find some peace there. So aside from picking apart that giant convoluted executive order on equity, which will come in a supplemental report that I'll link to this video, be sure and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that. We'll also definitely be keeping an eye on the players at the executive level, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Treasury. In this case, again, they seem to get delegated a lot of powers that are given to the president. So make sure you're subscribed. Please give it a like and even a share, and we'll keep doing this. We'll keep an eye on the big players.